Hello, welcome to the How Good Innovation Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. As a way of introducing one another, if our audience members would like to put their name and where they're based, if you'd like, you can put your role or the company that you work for into the chat, and that way we can get to know each other a little bit, even though we won't have the chance to formally introduce one another. My name is Leah Wolf. I'm currently in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm the head of regenerative education and content here at How Good. I am so excited to be speaking with our panelists today. We'll be speaking with Anna Hawkins, a sector lead at CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, Nadia Bishai, the Senior Director of Reporting Governance at PepsiCo, and her colleague Rob Meyers, who is the Vice President of Sustainable Agriculture, also at PepsiCo. We'll be talking about the advantages and challenges of developing voluntary sustainability standards ahead of regulatory changes. And we have two more fantastic sessions scheduled before the end of the year that I'd like to draw your attention to. December 1st, we'll be joined by Kendrick Repko and Justin LaCroix from Ahold Delhaize, USA. We'll be talking about how different departments within the same organization can collaborate toward progress in emissions reductions without having to be experts in policy. And on December 8th, we'll be talking about preventing greenwashing to build consumer loyalty and avoid risk. We'll be joined by two companies who are known for their transparency. Darcy Schreiber-Knowles will be representing Dr. Bronner's, and Heather Terry will be joining us. She is the founder and CEO of GoodSim. So I hope to see you at one or both of those. My colleague Kate is going to put the registration link into the chat. Even if you can't make it, it's worth registering so that you can watch the recording afterward. And finally, our agenda for today, we'll finish up our introduction. We'll have a 40 to 45-minute conversation with our panelists. And as we continue with our discussion today, I'll invite the audience to put questions for our speakers into the chat. I'll do my best to get to them and relay them to our panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our esteemed guests. If each of you could tell me a little bit about yourself, your role, and how you ended up working in sustainability. Let's start with Anna, and then Nadia, and then over to Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. So great to be here today. Thanks for having me. My name is Anna Hawkins, and I'm a sector lead on the corporate engagement team at CDP. I am based in Manhattan, New York, and I was always passionate about sustainability and studied it in school. So that's how I ended up at CDP. To give you a little bit of background for CDP, for those who don't know it, we are an environmental nonprofit with the world's largest collection of self-reported environmental data. And this year we had over 18,000 companies respond to our questionnaire at the request of investors and customers, including PepsiCo. So it's fun to be here with Rob and Nadia. Personally, I work with companies reporting to CDP to support them through the disclosure process and to take the next steps in their sustainability and reporting work. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Nadia?
Yeah, sure. Similar to Anna, I used to be at CDP as well. So I joined PepsiCo recently to, actually very topical to this discussion, but to support in all of the regulatory preparedness and underlying governance systems that we have to put in place, basically to be ready to report for all of the upcoming regulations, ESG related regulations. So happy to be here and share my experience with you. And before that, I've over 10 years of experience in the ag sector, working at Buggy, which is a global agribusiness company. So very happy to share each and every part of my journey with everyone on this call. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Hi, I think it's me. Nice to see everyone. Happy to be here. I'm Rob Meyers. I work in PepsiCo. Head up our sustainable agriculture team. I've been with PepsiCo for almost 26 years. I have an environmental engineering background, and I was hired into PepsiCo to help with their manufacturing facilities, water and wastewater treatment, and energy conservation. And so I started in sustainability before it was really even a title at PepsiCo, and I've had lots of different jobs between then and now. Now I'm on a team that reports up into our Chief Sustainability Officer, and we just celebrated our 1-year anniversary of our sustainability framework that we call PepsiCo Positive. And my team and I support the business in the positive agriculture pillar of that sustainability framework.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Very impressive backgrounds. And it's inspiring to think that, when you started your career, Rob, for example, sustainability not being a title, and now it's such a big part of so many powerful organizations' strategy and overall values. And so I think I'd like to start out just by asking how each of your organizations is thinking about the coming decade in terms of the environmental impact regulations that are likely to come and the sustainability work that you're already doing. If we want to start with Nadia this time, and then we can go Rob and Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an exciting time for sustainability for that reason. We see like the incorporation of ESG in different aspects of regulations across the globe, with, of course, the current focus on mandatory ESG disclosure requirements. So definitely the most expensive of this is EU CSRD, as some of you know, and the EU taxonomy reporting requirements, which basically all of this does, what this does is elevate sustainability reporting to the same level and importance as financial reporting, which over the long run, this will be critical at ensuring ESG is at the core of company strategies. One thing that I like to point out and remember is that, of course, the regulations build on current existing standards. So frameworks and standards like TCFD, SASB, GRI, lately net zero standards and science-based targets. All of these voluntary disclosure frameworks that, CDP, among others, has been championing for years are essentially the basis of what the regulations are being inspired on and based on. And today there is a shift towards forming ISSB, so international standards that more regulations should be following in the future. So overall, I think companies who have over time aligned themselves with these evolving voluntary frameworks are readier than others to basically incorporate a lot of the metrics that are required from the regulations. Of course, climate is the most advanced when it comes to looking at the frameworks out there. One of the things, of course, we're noticing is some of these regulations are so expensive that they're starting to ask companies to report on things on which there are no frameworks. So of course, that's a balance that we all have to kind of straddle. But I mean, one of the areas that I don't want to undermine is that even for companies like PepsiCo, who have over the years aligned with these voluntary disclosure platforms and expanded the scope of ESG reporting over time, the fact that you're moving from a voluntary disclosure to investor grade disclosure, that requires documentations, controls to support third-party assurance, implies timeliness of data from sustainability equivalent to financial reporting. And this we're finding is basically requiring a shift and a real understanding of the level of significance of investments that will enable us to get there. But at the core of it, this is really for leading companies, that's where the challenge is to basically raise the bar on sustainability, to put it at the core, the same way financial reporting, has done and has been doing over the past 60 years, and we don't have that luxury of time in this case. But yes, I think this has been our experience to date, and happy to address any specifics around that moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds like for companies that have a bit of a head start on the regulatory mountain, if you'll permit me a metaphor here, are already kind of at base camp, and they're not having to jump straight from the bottom all the way to the top in terms of what sounds like a pretty heavy lift data-wise to meet these new reporting standards. Rob, I'd love to hear if you have anything to add.
I think for us at PepsiCo and really across the food and beverage industry, one of the things that we've seen change is more of what we call an outcomes-based set of goals, which requires credible measurement and communication of the impact that that you're delivering. And so we work really closely with Nadia and her team to stay aligned to how to do that credibly, make sure we have the right kind of systems in place. And it is a bit tricky sometimes when there are new frameworks that are still under development. And so you get a little bit ahead of where the regulations are. And we need to, because we need to drive those impacts and those outcomes for lots of reasons. And so that's one of the big challenges that we kind of have. But at PepsiCo and some of our, many of our peers, we're not letting that slow us down.
Absolutely. Anna, I'm really interested to hear CDP's perspective on this.
Yeah, this is a really exciting time for us. We were thrilled with the SEC proposed climate rule. It does feel like a culmination of a lot of our work, as Nadia mentioned. And, we feel like mainstream or environmental reporting is now mainstream, and it's the expectation that investors and customers and other stakeholders have. And I think this is what we've seen with the SEC proposed climate rule. At CDP, we're also, focusing on expanding into other planetary boundaries. So this year, we added a biodiversity module to our climate change questionnaire, and we expect that will grow with the future, and other topics in nature will grow in our questionnaires. And then in addition to the 18,700 companies that responded to the climate change questionnaire, we also had over 1,000 companies respond to our forest questionnaire, and 3,900 companies respond to our water questionnaire. So climate change is a big focus for us, but it's definitely not the only focus. So we're excited to expand, further into that, into more nature and planetary boundaries. But yeah, I think also Nadia made a great point about other standards like the ISSB coming out. And we announced last week at COP27 that CDP will be integrating the ISSB standard into our disclosure platform, our disclosure system in 2024. So that's really exciting. And, we feel like voluntary reporting is an excellent way for companies to meet their reporting standards or reporting goals and sustainability goals and be prepared for this regulation.
Thank you so much. And I'm really excited about the idea of this more holistic view of sustainability beyond just carbon. So I want to come back to that in a bit, but for now, I'd like to talk and just dig a little bit deeper into some of the standards that each of your organizations have voluntarily put into place that have helped on the Pepsi side, maybe prepare you for some of the incoming regulatory changes. And then on the CDP side, how they've maybe helped shape regulatory changes thus far. So Anna, if you want to start this time talking about that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I feel like one of the most important standards is the recommendations of the TCFD, or one of the most important things to align with is the recommendations of the TCFD. CDP has been fully aligned with those recommendations since 2018. And through our questionnaires, we request companies to report on emissions, targets, risks, and opportunities related to climate change, deforestation, and water security. And those have all been aligned with those recommendations. I think we all know that the SEC proposed climate rule is in line with this framework. So just really, I think companies that are responding to CDP are pretty prepared for that, for any regulations aligned with the TCFD recommendations, such as the SEC proposed climate rule.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah. And Rob, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the standards that you've been working on at Pepsi, and how that has sort of put you ahead of the curve when it comes to this new sustainability reporting directive?
I'll probably have to tap my colleague Nadia on that one, because she holds us, she keeps us honest when it comes to reporting against standards that are coming our way.
Okay, let's take it over to Nadia.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, maybe I'll step back, because your first question is going beyond carbon, right? And I think that's the core of it. And I think that's how, so, standards are very important, because they allow companies to focus and really understand how the community as a whole is evolving in thinking. And so, I mentioned, Anna mentioned TCFD, but of course, we've seen, for example, the European regulations, incorporating GRI at their core. And so, the known ones, TCFD, SASB, and GRI are the kind of key drivers of a lot of this regulation. And also we're following closely the TNFD, because that would be the equivalent of TCFD for nature. But I think beyond the standards, what the regulations are implying, right, is that sustainability becomes at the core of business, just like finance or financials are. And so and I think, and to that extent, that's what PepsiCo has done with the launch of PepsiCo Positive, because it's beyond the sustainability program, right? The sustainability is seen as a tool for end-to-end transformation, and PepsiCo Positive touches on, many elements, including like regenerative agriculture, where Rob can add definitely much more in-depth information on that than I can, but also looking at a value chain and looking at products, at end products. And so, the standards do anchor companies, but like with the European regulations, they've gone beyond the standards, right? And so I think the key is to make sure that sustainability is embedded across the company's value chain. And I would like to bring up internal standards. So basically, one of the things that we've put in place over the past years, and I can't personally take credit for that, but that PepsiCo has in place, is basically a governance framework. And so it's not enough to just report on sustainability data, but that reporting has a governance framework which was developed in collaboration with control and legal departments. And this data, before it's being released, it's being certified and reviewed, and that's kind of, like I would say, level A, and then the regulation is going to push us to level C or level D, right, if we want to match the level of rigor for financial reporting. But also digitization, like I was surprised, I don't know how many companies have sustainability digitization teams, and PepsiCo does. So there is a digitization team in place with a clear digital strategy, developing a data architecture that is in line and heavily championed by our IT and analytics organizations. And so I think this like dichotomy of like governance and digitization are critical internal standards or foundations that companies will need to have in place to build upon for the regulations. And the last thing I want to mention is corporate spend. So a lot of the regulations are now focusing on taxonomy, or how much companies are spending on sustainable activities. So we've already started the road of kind of incorporating sustainability into capital expenditure, and that's essentially what markets and investors and regulators are now increasing scrutiny on, which is like quantifying the level of spend on sustainability. So, and that takes a long time, and it's very intensive, data intensive. And so I would just like to point out to these four things, like sustainability as the core, governance, digitization, and really linking sustainability to spend internally in the organization as internal kind of pillars to frame the work ahead on.
Yeah, and Rob, do you want to expand a little bit on the Pepsi? The Pepsi One, the Pepsi Plus, Beyond. I've seen the logo, and I'm sorry, say that again.
Positive. PepsiCo Positive.
Pepsi Positive. Would you like to expand a little bit on that? I know I'm most familiar with the water impact work that you're doing as a part of that program, which is very ambitious. And I think that, as Nadia was saying, a lot of the sustainable activity reporting will be helped just by more broadly sustainability programs. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about your work doing that.
Yeah, sure. So the PepsiCo Positive is a sustainability framework that cuts across our entire organization, it's one of the three core, really programs that are championed even by our CEO. The PepsiCo Positive Sustainability Framework, delivering our financial performance, and then also this big digitization journey that we're on to more holistically digitize our entire business end to end. The sustainability framework, we kind of look at it in three pillars. We have a positive choices pillar, which gets into our product portfolio. We have positive value chain, which covers off on our company-owned sort of sustainability when we look at our manufacturing facilities and our fleet. And it's also where you'll find our commitment to more sustainable packaging, our science-based and net zero climate targets, and our water commitments. And then positive agriculture, which is the pillar that I am responsible for delivering, has three main goals under it. One is commitment, and they're all 2030 goals. One is a commitment to sustainably source all of our key ingredients by 2030. The second one is to promote the spread of the adoption of regenerative agriculture practices for all of our key ingredients across our key ingredient footprint. And it's an outcomes-based goal. So that's where, we're measuring the impact in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, positive biodiversity impacts, positive impacts to watersheds, and also, sustainable livelihoods of growers in our supply chain. And then we have a specific goal for livelihoods of improving the livelihoods of at least 250,000 people in our agricultural supply chain through measurable impact. And those three together make up the suite of objectives that we have under positive agriculture. And then we have a whole slew of other commitments that come into it with, that overlap with commitments to human rights and no deforestation and land rights and, gender equity and all those sorts of things come into the purview of the team as well.
Wow. Thank you so much. And I'm noticing, a lot of quantifiable language, right, in those goals, which I think is one of the most important things when we're trying to move towards sustainability and regenerative agriculture. Kind of codifying those sustainability goals as part of larger company objectives is one of the first steps in making sure that you're making meaningful progress towards those kinds of things. And so I think that's really, really impressive to hear. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into the greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. And I'd like to hear a little bit from your perspective what the business case is for reducing environmental impact, because I think we have a pretty clear sense of the moral case. We're starting to get a clearer picture of the regulatory case. But when you're talking to a sustainability executive or maybe someone else in the executive suite that's a big decision maker, how are you making that business case, particularly when it comes to those scope 3 reductions in your value chain?
Well, one of the things that we've had the opportunity to do for our agricultural work, which I highly recommend, is we've dragged those guys out of the C-suite into the field. We've had a number of experiences with that. Recently, I had the opportunity a few months ago to take our CEO through the Midwest Corn Belt. And we had open sort of grower roundtables, and the farmers were able to have a dialogue with our CEO to talk about their risks, the risks that they're seeing. And, they don't always are, it isn't always articulated as a, climate change risk in that language, but they talk about how the weather is becoming less certain, and there's more disruption associated with, weather events. And they talk about uncertainties around, when they can plant and when they can harvest, and the growing seasons are changing. And that's a common story that you hear around the world. And so those are real risks that farmers face. And if, as a food and beverage company, it's kind of obvious to say it, but our business depends on the availability of, good quality, secure agricultural raw materials. And so the risks that the farmers face everywhere are our risks. And nothing brings that to light more for an executive than to actually see it, and so that, that's been very impactful. So that we start to talk about things like theories of change and all this sort of stuff that sustainability people talk about. It's grounded in their experience in actually seeing the reality and talking to farmers in the field. So I think, kind of that experiential moment is really important when you're trying to sell the importance of the work that you do and with the senior executive.
Yeah, absolutely. A connection to the rest of the supply chain while sort of couching it in this reduction of supply chain risk mitigation is kind of what I'm hearing. I think that's really compelling. Anna, I'm gonna direct this question to you. Do you think that the food and beverage industry at large is meeting the moment from an environmental harm reduction perspective and from a regulatory preparedness perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're seeing companies in this industry that are, setting really ambitious targets and taking meaningful action to meet those goals. We're definitely seeing a high level of engagement from companies in this industry. I think a huge priority is setting science-based targets. I mean, we know that in 2021, companies joining the SBTI were predominantly from services, manufacturing, and a lot from food and bev and agriculture industries. So that made up like nearly half of the companies that were joining the SBTI. So I think we can see that, companies are doing the work and they are setting these ambitious targets, but we're not there yet. There's always room for improvement. But the good thing about knowing that all these companies in this industry have already committed or have validated targets is that there's obviously a pathway of success that's, established out there, and that hopefully companies can collaborate and work together and see what their peers are doing to try to build off of that and have success as well for themselves.
Thanks so much. And Nadia, I'm gonna pose the same question, but with an emphasis on that regulatory preparedness perspective. I think that you're probably in rooms with, people who are chewing on this question pretty meaningfully, and I'd love to hear your input on whether you think that they're anywhere close to meeting the moment.
Good question. Depends on which regulation, but in any case, I mean, I think that the way to answer this is to say that you're right, it's a mountain. And so when companies are looking at this, they're trying to find, and I think that's the problem, right? When you get regulations from different parts of the world for a global company, it's like we're trying to find the commonality, right? Like the common elements that need to exist to satisfy across the board. And so when I talk about digitization or controls, and these are common elements, right? Financial systems that now have to be tailored to represent sustainability spend, on a global level. Like, I think that's where companies are trying to anchor at, right? Setting up these structures that are common in nature between a lot of these regulations. And so that's basically like the foundation that we can build on top of that. I think, and different companies look at it differently, right? And tackle different things differently depending on their priorities. So US-based companies that might not, have a requirement to report in the EU will be heavily focused on SEC, right? Global companies that cross both have to do both. And so European companies are, and they've, some of them had started reporting under SFDR, if I get, my acronyms get mixed sometime. But, so we see it different. It's going to be different depending on the company's exposure. But the one commonality is like, you're going to need faster data. It's going to have to be more digitized and higher level of controls. And what companies are doing is they're bringing these teams together. So sustainability teams with control teams, with legal teams as one unit, right? And to elevate, the potential impact to the company of actually having this being a required or a mandatory report versus a voluntary report. So I think this maybe is the, I would say, like, from what I've seen, is the commonality across the organizations now. But, is everyone going to be at the same level of readiness and time? I think it just depends on where you're starting from and how big the mountain is. And that's different by company.
Totally. Yeah, I think that that's something that How Good in our Scope 3 offering has really seen as one of the main obstacles for companies who are looking to reduce these impacts, and that data, collection, aggregation, and measurement, particularly when you have such a complex supply system, and wrangling data from all of your suppliers can be really, really difficult. And so that's, how we look at things, our data methodology being that we want to have a mix of our research based on geography, but also being able to input supplier data where necessary. But I think that this main thread that I'm hearing of the main challenge being data collection and digitization I'm wondering if there are any other challenges that come to mind, maybe not at the same level of that data collection, but on an internal buy-in level, on a widespread adoption level, on a consumer education level. Are any of those things that sound,
Well, I think one thing that I would comment on, I would say there's a healthy tension between having, the ability to communicate credible outcomes and impact. And it's a balance, right? So being able to do that, but also having that not be everything that you invest in, because, you want to invest in the impact, much more than you want to invest in the measurement and verification. And sometimes those can get upside down. And as a sustainability professional that really wants to drive impact, I think there's a need to balance it. So in agriculture, we've done some work around measurement and verification, and it can become quite costly when you start talking about needing to do soil samples in a grid and all this stuff. And all of a sudden you start to do these projects, and half of the investment is just going to doing all of the sampling. And so we need to really, and this is where innovation and technology, I think, can come in to help us. We need better models, we need better science, we need to be able to leverage and trust remote sensing, and the scientific models need to be developed further. And so, those tools and systems, need to be developed so that we can spend most of our money on actually driving the impact that we need to drive.
Yeah, and I think I would second that in a sense, in saying, I think that's the real thing, is we make sure we're not just spending the money to comply, right? That the actual compliance process results in a positive outcome. And I would hope, and that's what we push back on, when the regulations are, to Rob's point, that is inherently what they're trying to do, right? Improve the outcome. And so one of the things that, collectively we try and push back on is requirements that are not doing that, right? So, requirements that are just basically cutting and slicing data for no perceivable impact, right? So I would second Rob 100% on that. And I think, when you talk about internal buy-in, yes, it's a problem. Sustainability is to have companies change the way they see sustainability as equivalent to financial reporting. I mean, that's huge to sell that internally, and it's not easy, right? And the magnitude of the investment that will be required to get to that level, and selling why that is needed, I think that's a huge obstacle. And it's easier depending on how embedded sustainability is in each company already. So it's part and parcel, but I don't want to say it's still here and financial reporting is here, right? And so this is trying to change the whole system. But in any case, I'm gonna get off my soapbox. But yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. And so Anna, that's the challenges from the Pepsi side of things, right? That's their perspective as a company that's, huge and very influential in the space. But I know that CDP works with companies from that enterprise level, and then also from the, more medium and even smaller size level. Do you think that those challenges are aligning with those kinds of organizations? Are you seeing a different set of challenges for those kinds of organizations?
Yeah, I think so. I think across the board, companies have these kinds of issues, especially for the smaller and medium-sized enterprise companies. It's not, sustainability might be, a request from a CDP customer might be the first time they've gotten this request, to collect this data and report on it. So I think the bigger companies might have this benefit of having had a CDP request for years and years and years, and knowing about CDP and knowing about this request to be transparent in your environmental impact. So thinks the smaller companies have that challenge where it's not so mainstream for them. Personally, I work only with investor requested companies, so those tend to be the big publicly traded companies. So that's a lot of my exposure to it. But I think this also, brings up or highlights why it's really necessary to have credible, comparable, standardized data, to demonstrate meaningful progress that companies are making. So I think that's where a lot of this voluntary reporting can come in, and hopefully in the future, this SEC proposed rule having a lot of transparency in what companies are doing and being able to make these credible claims as to what kind of reductions they're making and efforts they're making towards their environmental impact reduction.
And in the same vein of this kind of collaboration that you're alluding to, how do you see the private sector and nonprofits and regulatory bodies working together going forward most effectively to accelerate decarbonization in the food supply system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we can all admit that it's a challenge, to make these credible claims, to show your work. And I think, as I mentioned, like the role of transparency and standardization is really, really important. So at CDP, our role is to bring best practices to companies at scale and then help the industries align on their asks from suppliers and publicly traded companies through our standardized questionnaires, and also then deliver that data back to the marketplace. I think this, enables companies and their stakeholders to benchmark their performance and then provide a high degree of transparency to their stakeholders. I think this is also the value in setting and having targets validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And what they do is they create frameworks based on climate science to show how companies are setting targets in line with what's required to keep global temperature down to that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So yeah, I think working together, we're already doing the work, and the goal for us really is to be able to bring standards and frameworks at scale on a global level, and to make sure that companies are being able to demonstrate the significant, ambitious action that they're taking, especially through things like the Science Based Targets Initiative.
Thank you so much. And then I'd love to hear the industry perspective on this. How do you see private sector working together with public sector and other regulatory bodies going forward to just really accelerate the decarbonization effort?
Yeah, I can take that on a little bit, and Nadia, I'm sure, can add to it. This is kind of a general comment, is that, in this space, especially when you get into scope 3, it's really important to recognize that it has to be pre-competitive, and it has to be very, very collaborative. And that means that we're really looking for that shared value, collaborative approach, and we'll work with anybody that can help us deliver the impacts that we need to deliver. And so we have lots of partnerships with NGOs. We have partnerships with government. We have partnerships with development. And we rely on them because there's a lot of really strong subject matter expertise within a lot of those organizations. And it's also, there are a lot of challenges that are very difficult to solve, and so we do need to work together and have people with different kinds of perspectives come together to solve some of these big challenges that we have. And then, so I think that's an important role for, NGOs to play. I think the other thing too is that NGOs still play a really important role in holding people, holding private industry accountable for delivering on the goals and commitments that we've made, because we do need to deliver. That's the days of setting a policy and calling it done are long gone. It's about really driving impact nowadays, and so we welcome the challenge. We call them critical friends, the NGOs that do hold us account, but also will work with us on driving impact and helping us live up to the commitments that we've made.
Nadia, I'd love to hear if you have anything to add to that. And then also, I think that Rob touched briefly on something that, even though we've been focused on the reporting side of the regulatory changes that are coming, we haven't touched much on the greenwashing litigation kind of I don't want to say trend, but uptick in the last, decade or so. And so I wonder if you could touch on that as well, as far as how we see maybe public and private interacting going forward.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think similar on the same lines that Rob mentioned. I mean, it's the interplay comes like, so non-for-profits and CDP and everyone that's been pushing for like greater transparency, right? The standards are set based on, hopefully now we're evolving, like based on science, and that's what companies need to understand where to focus, right? And so, however, on the flip side of it, of course, is like when you start implementing a lot of these standards in like global organizations with high complexity, that unearths questions that potentially whomever set the standards or like did not like foresee, right? Because it's like, so I mean, I think the best way to see this is, and I know like TNFD or all of that, they're trying to like run pilots, and so the best way to truly work together is to look at science, use that as the target, but then try and see like the implications of applying it to a real running business, and then with that iterate through really what is the best way to capture a standard or a regulation so that it's effective within the real life context. And so I think the methodology that's now being taken, where like we don't issue a standard until we run pilots with companies, etc., I think that works. I think the issue, like when you come to regulations, is like you have a public comment period, you comment, and then they go back and they try and balance out all of these comments. And so non-for-profits who are working directly with companies, who are aware of the complexities that companies have to deal with, are a great conduit into kind of trying to inform the regulatory bodies as to like how best to kind of make sure the regulations are driving the transparency that they're trying to address, right? And so, and I think like in the middle of all of this, sometimes this point is missed, right? Let's bring the real life complexity to bear on something that's going to have to hold companies publicly accountable. And that can only push this forward in a better direction, because I mean, we're all here sustainability professionals, so we all want the impacts, and to Rob's point, so that we don't spend time spinning wheels on things that are not pushing the needle forward, basically. But I mean, to your point, answering your point specifically, I mean, again, like regulations are going to push for transparency and standardized transparency, and that will reduce the possibility of greenwashing, right? So I mean, the standardized reporting is the key for that, and I lean on CDP on that again, because that's what they've also been championing, right? The more you have information that's comparable, the more it's harder for companies to do that. So I think that's the key.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think if I can hop in too, I think Nadia makes a really good point. Having that standardized comparable data, like I already mentioned, but then also having a transparent scoring methodology is really helpful to, make sure that we have qualitative and quantitative measurements and thresholds that companies have to meet to get an A or an A-, whatever it may be. So I think having that really helps stakeholders understand that you're not just getting an A because you wrote a really nice story about things that you're doing for sustainability, but you're meeting certain levels that we have laid out in our scoring methodology. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I think it's easy too for people like ourselves who work in sustainability. I think a lot of people on this call either work in sustainability or are interested in sustainability. Our level of literacy when it comes to that kind of scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, the GHG protocol, is very high compared to not just consumers, but I would say like the industry at large. And so people who I think would be interested in making positive changes within their organization also need to have we need to be able to communicate to them equally as effectively as we do to consumers, to kind of aid in their advocacy for better policies within their own organizations. So I'm gonna ask this question first of Anna and CDP, and then I'll ask Rob and Nadia to add their perspective. But both CDP and PepsiCo have broadened the scope of sustainability reporting to include those more holistic measures of environmental and social impact that we were talking about earlier, beyond carbon, right? Can you talk a little bit more about why that's important, specifically when we're aiming to mitigate climate change?
Yeah, definitely. I think, all of these topics are interlinked, and climate change affects water security as deforestation and land use change emissions affect climate change. From, for example, the demand for forest risk commodities driving deforestation accounts for like 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions, obviously a huge impact on climate change and carbon. And then the companies are also facing economic challenges from water issues linked to climate change. We did a water report and found that $15.5 billion in assets have been stranded or at risk due to water issues. So I think it's pretty clear to us at CDP, and this is why we try to request companies to report across these issues, is that understanding and managing these risks are really key for companies' long-term success. I think companies need to have a holistic image of their environmental impact, because these issues are all really interconnected and they end up exacerbating one another.
Yeah, and it's totally right. I think we need to avoid, there's a syndrome, I didn't coin the phrase, but carbon tunnel vision. We need to be wary of that. And that's very true in agriculture. And so just two examples of where we're actually leading with the S part of ESG, the social part, to deliver environmental outcomes, including climate, positive climate outcomes. We've got an initiative we launched in partnership with Nestle, Unilever, and Procter & Gamble in Southeast Asia. It's called the RIMBA Collective, RIMBA. You kind of look it up. And what that program involves is, kind of making it more valuable for communities that live near forests to keep the trees there or plant new trees, right? And so we're working with 30,000 people to make them, make it sort of economically and sort of from a livelihood standpoint, more sustainable for them to be stewards of preserving and reforesting. 500,000 hectares of endangered forest. But we're leading with that social component. We're doing a lot of work in women's economic empowerment around the world as well to demonstrate how you can deliver environmental outcomes by providing women with more agency, giving them opportunities to farm and other entrepreneurial opportunities. And so linking that to not just environmental benefits, but also business benefits. And so it's not a philanthropic exercise. It's actually demonstrating that it's a core business imperative, that we do that kind of work. And so I think, that it adds complexity, but it's hugely important you almost can never separate the E from the S. They have to go together, and they're mutually supportive, and you can't deliver one exclusive of the other.
Thanks so much. I'd like to ask next, you got me thinking about, as we're facing a time of economic uncertainty, what you would say, I think we're hearing a lot. I certainly hear a lot in the sustainability space about how the first department to get their funding cut is the sustainability department. And so what would you say to an organization that's considering putting Scope 3 and climate change mitigation on the back burner? I really liked what you were just saying, sort of in terms of kind of trying to think about it not as a cost or cash outlay, but rather as an investment. And I wonder if you could elaborate on some other ways that you might frame it to continue that investment rather than cut back in a time of scarcity.
Well, I think that first off, we have support all the way up to our CEO, and he truly believes in the importance of sustainability as a business imperative, and understands that there's real material risk if we don't invest in this ESG work and drive those outcomes. And so it's about, enabling the growth of our business, securing supply, protecting our brands. So there's the equity of our business is core to that. In tough times, that we always look for, we're forced to look for, ways to do things more cost effectively. But what's been encouraging for me recently is where we have seen, budgets getting crunched, but the sustainability budgets are getting crunched less. So it's more of a trim than a big haircut for our sustainability work. And I think that didn't happen overnight. It kind of happened through kind of the recognition and commitment by a lot of the sustainability professionals to try to shine the light on it, and also just a really strong support from our executive leadership, at PepsiCo. And I'm hopeful that our peers in the food and beverage company realize that too, because this isn't just a side job anymore. Sustainability is, especially in the food and beverage industry, is just core to being able to grow our business. And so I think that recognition is there, and I'm hoping that we find ways to continue to invest in delivering the impacts that we need to protect our businesses.
And Anna, I saw you kind of nodding your head along to some of the things Rob was saying there. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, definitely. I think you made great points. I think, we're seeing that sustainability is no longer a nice to have. It's a core aspect of economic success for companies. I think we can see that from the pressure that investors and policymakers are putting on this transparency and this, emphasis on sustainable action and real action. We're seeing that investors care about this from a financial perspective, and they're making decisions based on environmental impact data. And specifically within your value chain, I think, as we talked about before, one of the burdens that these smaller suppliers and these companies are facing is, immaturity in their sustainability practices and not having the data already being collected. So I think now's the time to act. Now's the time to start engaging your suppliers in your value chain and starting them on a pathway, where you can work together to reduce your emissions and get the world aligned with that 1.5 degree Celsius goal.
Thanks so much. Nadia, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is the quantification of risk, right? And I think that's one of the things that PepsiCo has done, and it's on our website. But in terms of really to try and quantify short, medium, and long-term risks from a lot of the factors, building on what Rob mentioned earlier, right? So it's really, and to have sustainability as one of the key risk mitigation, risk management issues that the senior executive as well as the board and all of that are having to address, right? So I think looking at it from a risk and sizing the risk is a good start of ensuring continued investment. And I would add, we've been talking about this all throughout, but I would add the regulations, right? Because this is not voluntary anymore. So making sure that internally there's enough visibility to the level of investment that's going to be needed to comply, working across the sustainability organization. So people like Rob who will push back and say, do we really need to do this? Because this is not creating impact, what? And that's kind of what you will need to show internally, that the due diligence has been done to make sure that, the money is being invested where it has the most impact for the company, as well as in ensuring compliance. So, I would say the risk and the risk quantification and actually anchoring on the regulations and, the need for requirement, trying to start quantifying what that means. I think that would be very important to make sure this doesn't happen, basically.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have one question in the chat here, and I'm going to put it to both of you at PepsiCo and whoever thinks they're best
Yeah,
position to answer it. How does PepsiCo influence change in indirect commodities versus direct commodities? Rob, it seems like you have an answer ready to go.
it's a great question, and it kind of goes back to something I said before, and that is that we need to work really collaboratively across our value chain, not just with our peers, but also with our suppliers and with our customers, and I've been very proud of the work that we've done, because actually collaborating with someone who you would normally compete with is kind of hard to do. But we're all sort of past that, and we are doing collaborative work. We need to do more. And we need to sort of like radically collaborate in this space, because 99% of the work that needs to be done is pre-competitive. So we take what we call as a shared value approach to this work, and where we really want to work together to co-create solutions. We want to work together to find and fund the investment that's needed. And there's some good examples of us doing that. Someone else also mentioned that we need to recognize that PepsiCo is a very large, successful company. We have a very large supply chain, and a lot of the suppliers that we work with, and even some of the customers that we work with, like Nadia and I are going to be one person plus another, probably a few jobs. So we have more resources, at PepsiCo than some of our suppliers. And so we are really trying to work to recognize that. We're creating opportunities to build capabilities, with the suppliers. We're trying to bring other partners in to help suppliers, decarbonize and address some of the social risks in our shared supply chain. And so we are really engaging with suppliers on that capability building, and not kind of putting everything on the supplier and sort of sitting back and waiting for things to happen, knowing that that they won't. And so the way that I like to say it simply is it's our responsibility to create demand for environmental and sustainable and social outcomes, but we also are responsible for creating the supply of them, as well. And so we do take that approach, as much as we can, where we have those, material risks that we need to address.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your candor. I love that you mentioned pre-competitive collaboration so much, because this innovation series and also our regenerative working group are both very much in the spirit of that pre-competitive collaboration. And so I hope that you will all join us again in our audience for our next innovation series. If you're interested in that regenerative working group, you can find it on our website. And most importantly, thank you so much, Anna, Rob, and Nadia, for joining us today. I know I enjoyed it immensely, and I'm sure that our audience did too. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. And if you have a holiday next week, I hope that you enjoy some time off with friends and family. That's all from me. I really appreciate you all being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.